Another significant modulator of PTSD needs mentioning, and I touched on it just a second ago, and that's about anger. This is where I think we have failed as adults, and regardless of your stance on school shootings, gun violence, regulation, police brutality, immigration, or politics, I think we all need to turn down the anger on this. Children who have, or adults who have little self-control will be emulated by the kids that watch them. When kids experience trauma, either individually or large scale, certain things work better when you discuss the trauma with them. First, it's important to focus, not to focus on emotional response of the traumatic event. Traumatic events produce shock, and shock needs time to settle. And instead, an important focus should be the child's current level of functioning and impairment. Judgmental statements don't help. Saying to a teenager, if you hadn't been drinking, this never would have happened, doesn't help. It just heaps on more shame. Placating statements like, at least you survived, or everything will be okay, do not help either. Rather, I'm glad you're safe with me now, and we will get through this together with the help of really good people. That will be more stabilizing and encouraging. And then correcting thoughts that are distorted is important as well. For example, a teenage girl who says, I was raped because I walked home late by myself. That needs to be corrected. How a mass trauma experience affects a child will vary greatly from individual, but know it can be very severe. School shootings or natural disasters, for example, can result in multiple traumas and losses for each child or person. Some kids might lose 2 good friends and a teacher in a school shooting. Some kids may experience the grief of a best friend who lost their parent in a hurricane. Children and adults who survive trauma, like a school shooting, may experience survivor's guilt, asking why they made it and their friends didn't. There's also potential with the constant news coverage of tragedies that many kids will begin to believe that the world is not a safe place. Lots of adults start to believe this too, but fortunately, large-scale trauma still is not the norm. I've always wondered, what would our outlook on life be if the news media reported 90% good and 10% bad? Finally, mass trauma discussion requires consistent approaches from school and the media and home and providers. That's certainly not happening nowadays. From the standpoint of coaching parents with regard to a child's traumatic experience, there are some do's and some don'ts. I tell parents to allow their kids to feel upset, to talk about things when they're ready to talk about things, to cry about what happened, to feel the sadness of the situation. And why do I say that to parents? Because dealing with tragedy is a real and inevitable part of our lives. It's on the checklist to adulthood for some kids. I tell parents to attempt to keep as much normal routine intact as possible. This might include family meals, bedtimes, and even chores. Limiting exposure to the news is important because reliving the story is not helpful. And parents and other important adults should reassure the child that they're safe and the event is over and will start healing. I also coach parents on the don'ts. For example, parents should not force a child to talk about things before they're ready. And asking personal details is probably not going to be particularly constructive. Expecting a teen or a child to be brave or tough or more adult is also not a good idea. They might show braveness or toughness, but it's important for parents to know not to expect it. A lot of parents have expressed to me concern about a child who regresses after different traumas, like sucking their thumb or bedwetting or baby talking. And all regression really is okay for a while. You've got to get over the shock of things. And so not unusual. Parents must compartmentalize their own feelings and emotions when their child has experienced trauma as well. This is hard. This is very hard for parents. And I'm speaking from personal experience. Parents will need friends and colleagues to come alongside them when their kid is struggling. There are a lot of evidence-based interventions. You guys are the experts for this. Trauma-focused CBT. Who does trauma-focused CBT here? Awesome. is a well-utilized approach for older kids with trauma. Safe Care is a parenting training program in situations of maltreatment, abuse, and neglect of a child who's under 5, and it's a home-based intervention. The Incredible Years is a series of programs with the goals of preventing and treating young children's behavior problems. It works with teachers and parents. As you work with children, you probably have come to realize that within the context of many families, social emotional buffering is scarce, if not non-existent. And in these situations, looking outside the home is very important. Seeking any and all adults in their immediate community to come alongside these kids. Certainly, the source of social emotional buffering can be the parents, but it can also be from other adults and needs to be. I send kids to the YMCA, the Big Brother, Big Sister, youth groups, community summer camps, team sports, martial arts, the First Tee, children's theater groups, just to name a few, trying to get them out of the house with good people to coach them and mentor them. A compelling question about caring for high-risk kids who are being traumatized in their families is this. I ask this almost daily. Is it possible to cure the family? What do you guys think? Is it possible to cure the family? I think it's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I think it depends. And we're all trained to work with a child and a family one at a time. But knowing what research suggests about social emotional buffering, we might need to consider additional strategies and focus our interventions from the outside in rather than the inside out. But this will take a paradigm shift, I'm afraid. I mean, how might population-based interventions really play out? Where would the resources come from to pay for it? Who might serve the community's youth as mentors and social emotional buffers if the parents can't? Would it be possible to recruit highly skilled and experienced retirees who otherwise play pickleball and Candy Crush? How would we screen and train potential buffering individuals, and who would oversee such programs? And how might they be monitored for effectiveness? But as I think about these kids that I take care of, that you take care of, I just think of the resources, the expertise that is in our communities that is never tapped into to help out. One good example of this is trauma-based education. This is emerging and very innovative format in K-12 schools which train and utilize teachers and administrators to teach and mentor through a trauma-informed lens. The George Lucas Foundation, founded in 1991, developed Edutopia, which is a program that uses several core strategies, including comprehensive assessments of each student, social emotional learning, integrated studies, and teacher development. In high-risk schools where this is used, like Fall Hamilton Elementary in Nashville, student academic scores have skyrocketed, that they go home every night, but their scores have skyrocketed because they find mentorship and challenge and life-changing buffering for 8 hours a day. The truth is, our approaches to societal problems usually are short-term solutions or band-aids rather than intergenerational strategies, which I believe is the direction we need to go with the information that we now know about ACEs. And currently there's just inadequate screening and identification of high-risk families in schools and in primary care providers. This needs to change. So what happened to Tommy? Let me tell you about Tommy. Tommy's like one of my favorite patients. I was lucky enough to connect him with an exceptional therapist who not only brought Tommy through trauma-focused CBT, but became a real role model to him in his life. His mother entered into a faith-based chemical dependency program and has remained sober for 4 years. Tommy and his mother started attending the local church, giving Tommy access to a new core group of friends in the youth program. Some of them encouraged Tommy to play basketball on the school team, which he did. And his coach has become an incredible mentor to him. He also excelled academically for the first time in many years because, and I quote, "My grandma wants me to do well in school." Her initial buffering in Tommy's life made the difference. Tommy is emerging from his family trauma in this new setting despite a very high ACE score. Tommy plans to go into the Marines after high school and wants to seek an education in counseling to help traumatized kids. You've heard the phrase, it takes a village. And when it comes to emerging through and out of childhood trauma, this is particularly true. So for kids like Tommy, the critical social emotional buffering occurred with his grandmother, his therapist, and then with his basketball coach. So life happens, doesn't it? We all have our own stories. We have our own journeys. And some of them are not easy. Sometimes our childhood experiences are good, pleasant, and peaceful, and sometimes they're not. What is clear today, though, is that those childhood experiences will affect our adult outcomes, both for good and not so good. Certainly, we all desire a world where all children have parents who care and are engaged and have other loving adults in their life who nurture and develop them and have ample opportunity to play with kids their age and experience joy. But reality is reality, and many grow up with difficulty, poverty, and violence. And each of these two scenarios have their most probable outcomes. Adverse childhood experiences inflict damage over time. But that's not the end of the story. For if it were, I would be pretty bummed out. The good news is that safe and stable relationships and social emotional buffering and healthy adaptation can and will make a way for adversity to be transformed for good in a child's life. So with that, I'd like to close and ask for any questions. I know I've thrown a lot of schmutz at you today, but I think it's really important to understand that the research is pretty clear on this. And I applaud all of you for the work that you do. Okay? Yes, question.
Dr. Tim, you mentioned the trauma-based education. What was that school or that research of 1991?
Yeah, if you look up Edutopia, Edutopia, it's part of the George Lucas Foundation, and this has been launched in not a lot, but some schools across the country, and it's unbelievable. And you can watch kind of videos and get a background on how they train the teachers to teach and mentor the kids with a focus from trauma, that kind of a trauma-informed focus and lens. It's really amazing to look at the differences that these kids experience. And yes, they go back home, and yes, the same stuff is going on there, but for 8 hours a day, they're getting what they need, and it's very encouraging. And I believe that interventions really need to go much more global and outside the home. Right now, the way child law is written, we got to do everything we possibly can to keep that child in the home. And I think that's fine, but as you know, it's an uphill battle for many families. Okay?
So maybe a question for someone in the audience. Does anybody know here in San Antonio if we have any particular school or any particular district that is really embracing the trauma-based education model? I work for a particular school district in Bexar County, but for anybody that's a Clarity staff or any other colleague, do you know? Because that's the school that I want to work at.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting when you look at stories about a school like the one in Nashville. I mean, the teachers are interviewed, and they absolutely can't wait to get to their job. They love it. And at least in Tucson, the feeling is we can't even keep teachers. They hate their job. They can't wait to leave. For a variety of reasons. And the problem is schools are not teaching in a trauma-informed lens. They're teaching the old-fashioned way. And these kids that are, especially in our inner-city population, wow, they're coming from high-risk families, and they need a lot more assistance. I think this kind of movement would make teaching a much more desirable career because you're really seeing the effects of amazing kind of way to help mentor these kids. Makes a difference. That's a great question. Does anybody know of any charter schools or anything like that in San Antonio greater area? Yes?
It's not necessary that I know of a particular school, but the conversation is starting. The Children's Shelter had a trauma-informed care conference last month, I think it was. So the conversation is starting. Edgewood did mental health first aid, and that has made a tremendous difference. Also, I believe it was Bernie, right? Bernie Independent School District also has done the mental health first aid, and then a lot of other stuff to support that. So their work has made some just phenomenal difference in the numbers, the percentages, and all that kind of wonderful data.
That's great. Yeah. In this particular program in Nashville, their behavioral problems, they're gone. They're gone. You know, what used to be complete chaos and couldn't control a classroom that's not even an issue anymore, because the kids are mentored and coached by their teachers because they've been trained on how to do that in an effective way that's trauma-focused. That's great. It's good to hear conversations are starting. Of course, these things take years to kind of develop and percolate, you know, and everybody has their own ideas. Yep. Yep. A large teacher organization has asked me to speak about how to make schools trauma-informed, because I think that is the first step. I mean, just imagine if every school was trauma-informed. They had community networking that had been created by the parent-teacher organization and the school administration, so that families that are high risk or kids who are in trouble, they could get shunted into the right places for counseling and family therapy, and that the kids were talked to and addressed in class in ways that are coming through the right lens. But right now, it's like somebody gets in trouble and they get in trouble. It's like nobody's really working with them to understand their story. That's why I started out with that whole story thing. You know, we all have our story. I know all of you have ACEs. All of you. Some of you might have an ACE score of 9. I don't know. I met a mom with an ACE score of 9. I do ACE scores on all my parents in my clinics, my faculty practice, and my behavioral practice. And it's unbelievable what some people have been through. And they're trying to parent, and they've never healed from those things. And so my purpose in that is to get the parents the help they need to start the healing process so that they can be the best parents to their kids. But there are very few pediatric clinics that screen parents for ACEs. Very few. But the discussion has started nationally. It really has. And I do have to tip my hat to the American Academy of Pediatrics, because they are really bringing this in, including trauma-informed conferences and everything for pediatricians to finally kind of digest this, get on board, and figure out what to do about it. So that's really encouraging to me.